Sure.
So, we can just start with introductions. I'm Miriam with Ceres Greenhouse Solutions, and I'm here with Roberto Meza. And you are with a number of different organizations. So I'll let you introduce yourself and who you're currently working for and what you're
Sure.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to share my story and my experience here. My name is Roberto Meza. I am co-founder and one of the farmers of Emerald Gardens, a year-round greenhouse farm on 35 acres in Bennett, Colorado. I'm also the co-founder and director of strategic partnerships at East Denver Food Hub, which is an organization that seeks to create equitable, resilient, and compassionate regional food systems via public and private partnerships, access to markets for local food producers, environmental stewardship, sustainable technologies, and just hoping to integrate an ecosystem in our local food economy that is reciprocal and that is built on the values that support local farmers as well as communities that experience food insecurity. But yeah, those are kind of like my two avenues for integrating a lot of things that we've encountered as first generation BIPOC farmers trying to develop a business and do good in our communities.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. I just want to introduce the purpose of us gathering today is to talk specifically on land access and food access. And I know that that's been a major part of your career, interest, life. And so I just want to ask you about what those things mean to you and the work that you're doing currently to push those values and those ideas forward in your world.
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with encountering those barriers head on as my business and farm partner and I were getting started. We were really lucky to have the support of our families as we acquired this 35-acre farm with nothing on it in Bennett, and subsequently needing additional startup costs to cover infrastructure and utilities and everything. So we basically built it from the ground up. And one of the first opportunities that we had to apply for a farm service agency loan, we were denied for various reasons that I think the FSA didn't really know what microgreens were, and they didn't understand that that was a viable business, even though like we had our financials very clearly laying out, hey, we're making money. This can actually function as a sustainable business, and we need startup capital to do that. And it just was incredibly difficult to get startup funds for that. So we just kind of took it one step at a time and developed different ways and strategies of acquiring the means that we needed to best meet our needs. And we basically just started working on increasing our sales and working with markets and wholesale accounts, as well as developing partnerships with our communities. Little did we know then that those partnerships would be key and so critical to us being able to pivot and remain viable during the pandemic. And that was literally how we saved our farm after the economic fallout of COVID. We lost all of our restaurants. We experienced issues with grocery stores, and the relationships that we built with food access organizations literally saved our farm. We realized then that integrating and connecting farmers to food access organizations and food access kind of partnerships were key to unearthing new models for our local food economy. And that kind of snowballed into so many different understandings and kind of learning that now has given us a good outlook on both land access and food access.
So just taking a step back, I realized we didn't really even define what either of those terms mean. So I'm just curious from your perspective, for those who aren't even aware of what food access means and land access means, if you wouldn't mind defining them as they mean, what they mean to you.
Yeah, so food access is a term that constitutes an awareness that food systems and the way that people access food are not equitable. So we're drawing attention to inconsistencies in the local food economy that oftentimes create barriers to access fresh food for certain communities, most of which are under-resourced to begin with. We've come to see food systems as models that structure and organize our relationships within our communities, meaning that for us, food systems are not spontaneously developed. They are engineered to function in a specific way to privilege some communities at the expense of others. And once we understand that, this isn't just happening naturally, that there are specific ways that food is distributed, acquired, produced, now we're more kind of, we're poised to actually intervene in those systems and create equitable food access via means of distribution, or even using what we're calling healthy food incentives or government programs that support communities' access to fresh food. That was literally why we started Emerald Gardens to begin with. Just to take it another step back, we wanted to create a year-round source of food while also addressing the barriers to access that food. And we didn't really know what those barriers were. We knew from a farmer's perspective what those barriers are to get up and running and to start a farm and develop markets. But distribution and access in these other complex ways was something that we didn't know much about until I actually started investing my time in, for example, working with the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council, which is addressing issues around food access, and then working with a lot of other organizations that have been doing this work for a long, long time, but haven't really gotten to the root of the problem of eradicating hunger. That is a conversation that we're now beginning to realize, that you can't solve hunger simply by donating food. And that's kind of what food access has come to mean in our spaces. And for us, it was like, wait a second, if we've been doing this for so long, why haven't we solved the problem? And it's precisely because we never get a chance to talk about poverty. We never get a chance to talk about the economic system that underpins hunger and thus structures efforts around food access. So for us, it's really been a journey of kind of checking our own assumptions and then understanding the paradigms that a lot of good meaning organizations are operating within, that I think limits their impact and their effectiveness by not drawing efforts directly to the root of the problem.
It's very interesting, because I think we start with this idea of land access, and it feels very obvious that we need more land, we need to be growing more, and it's more tangible, even though it's still hard, and there's great inequities even in land access. But then when we start speaking about food access, it's harder to pin down, because you can have the land access, but it doesn't mean that the distribution is fair. It doesn't mean that people are able to access that food. And so it kind of takes it one step further into these multidimensional, more complex
Yeah,
subjects that you're exploring, which is, okay, now that we have food, and as you spoke to earlier with COVID, all this stuff really came to light. You've created a system, a company where you're producing food, but now that you have that food, how do you make it accessible to people? And not only make it accessible to people, but teach them how to create systems to make it accessible to each other and to other people. And that's where we get a lot more complicated, and it's
exactly.
a
Yeah, I think you
challenge.
hit the nail on the head, right? It's for us, it's come to mean a discussion around access and power dynamics, and
Yes.
who has those resources, whether it's land or purchasing dollars, or capital resources, et cetera, and how does access get situated? How is that established? And who gets to determine who has access to resources, economic opportunities, or food? And I think it's bound up in a lot of politics, and just bound up in a lot of assumptions as well, that generally come from a space of deficit, that communities can't do this for themselves. The antidote to that, I think, is what is encapsulated in a term called sovereignty, which
Mm,
when applied to food systems, right, means the opportunity and the will of people to define their own food and farming systems that are culturally rooted and are equitably kind of situated and focused. And that's what started to emerge in our relationships with food access organizations. Now we had the opportunity to address economic viability for farmers, to transition farmers to our land so they can start growing for this amazing kind of cooperative model that we're working with East Denver Food Hub and the farmers that we work with, to then provide food to food pantries. And then, it was like the federal relief funding that was coming to address food insecurity actually had another dimension. From our perspective, it was investment capital to jumpstart new farms and to generate a new model that was focused on linking farmers to food access organizations, but also thereby creating opportunities for land access and capital acquisition. So with that funding, they basically contracted East Denver Food Hub to aggregate and distribute local food, either via bulk pallets or food boxes. And because we got that money up front, we could then forward contract with farmers who could cover their startup costs for the season and get up and running to supply that demand for our communities. And that for us was the kind of first glimpse of what we're calling food sovereignty, that we can actually stimulate the economy, provide jobs, and be able to meet the food needs of our communities simply by creating these forward contracts with intermediaries and local producers. So how do we scale that, right? And right
yeah.
now there's a big opportunity with farmers that are retiring that need to transition that farm to new farmers. There's a lot of family members that don't want to take up the family business because they've seen the challenges and hurdles of their parents and are more drawn to other service industry jobs.
And there's also a little bit of a taboo around it as well. It A lot of perception around farming as being
Yeah.
done by a certain class or being
Yes.
less valued as other professions. I've seen that a lot, where why don't we value the farmer as the pinnacle of society? It's the person who's producing our food, and yet we kind of demean the profession for cultural reasons, probably more
Yeah.
than anything. And yeah, so I think there's a lot tied up in that as well.
Definitely, definitely. And the old motto that farmers are cash poor but asset rich, right, is also kind of a deterrent. And I think that COVID has been such a page turner that we now have the opportunity to rapid prototype new models that are generating wealth and profit for farmers, because the issues that were there before COVID have now been kind of elevated to such a level of clarity that people are interested in farming now, in food, because we all experienced that moment of vulnerability of going to the supermarket and seeing empty shelves. Like, that's huge for people that have just relied on the convenience of expecting their food to be there 24/7. So now, the fragility of supply chains has emerged, and also the fact that, like, we can't just rely on this level of convenience, because one day it may not be there. For Colorado, that's such a critical lesson to learn, because we're a landlocked state and we depend on the supply chains to function in a way that is resilient. And so COVID allowed the local food supply chains to prove themselves as more resilient than national supply chains, because of the shorter chains in that link, in that whole process. When communities were used to just getting donations of food, people were hoarding, so there was no food that was being donated. And when there was major breakdowns in the supply chains, it was East Denver Food Hub and High Plains Food Co-op and other hub-to-hub partners that were quick and nimble enough to pivot and be able to supply food when the national distributors simply could not.
So if you're speaking to scale now, how do we, there's a balance between the desire to scale these things so that we can make them more applicable for everyone, but where is the balance between sovereignty and scale? Because once you reach a certain scale, it seems to me like you take away some of that sovereignty, because then you're no longer in direct control of your own supply. So where do you find that balance?
The balance is actually an intersection of values-based procurement. So what we're doing is leading with those values and finding values-aligned partners. And that's why we don't have salespeople, right? Or sales force. We have value chain coordinators that are trying to incentivize farmers who are stewarding the land, not contributing to climate change, right? Who are also honoring the dignity of their workforce and paying dignified wages and taking care of their livestock, right? Actually being stewards of their livestock. And so I think by kind of supporting and incentivizing those farmers with access to markets, whether they're meeting the immediate need through food access organizations, or as we're doing now, building a long-term model to supply institutions, who are most of our efforts are going to address the volume needs of those large-scale institutions, so that we can then aggregate from small, medium-scale producers. I mean, I think that's where, again, we reach another level of sovereignty that is reciprocal and regenerative, right? We understand now that regenerative agriculture is healing our soils. Then regenerative economics can heal our communities. And so those values are what grounds the supply chain, so that we honor the integrity of the sovereignty of reciprocity and sustainability. Even though we're a small company right now based here in Montbello, we're actually coordinating a hub-to-hub network that is scaling local supply chains based on those values and extending beyond the borders of Colorado, so that we can meet the seasonal gaps that are currently a hurdle to be a completely sustainable state in terms of its agricultural production. So that's kind of where these decentralized kind of nodes, I liken them to mycelial networks that mushrooms are so equipped to establish, but now on a social food web rather than a soil food web model.
I love the analogies, the nature analogies, because it's just bringing it all together. Like, we're learning from the way that Mother Nature works, and we're establishing systems based off of Mother Nature instead of
Yes.
the reverse, which has been our past history.
Yes.
What would you say to like someone who is really interested in food access, but doesn't really know how to begin? Because it can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of organizations out there, and people are busy with their own lives and own things. And I'm curious if you have any, preliminary places to start for people, or advice to give to people if they're interested in these things, how they can participate.
I mean, one good opportunity is to seek out your local food policy councils. There's not every state or every city has one, but here in Denver, we have a really good one. Jefferson County also has one, and they basically are in charge of creating healthy communities and addressing food access in a myriad of ways because of the composition of their membership that can come from city governments or farmers, or even just companies and possibly some food service industry partners as well, who are all working with food in some way and can provide some insight into how to improve the local food economy. The other way is to engage with some of the food access organizations that are already here, doing some innovative work and moving beyond donation to community wealth building, employment creation, workforce training and development. And I think that's where we really come to the next stage of food access organizations. For example, there's Metro Caring has been one of our most important partners. They actually have created a food sovereignty position that is looking and researching into models that allow them to become more transformative in their advocacy and in their programming. So they actually support community members with the tools and the resources that they need to define and implement their own solutions. I think that's another level and layer to sovereignty, right? Is that we're moving away from the paternalistic nonprofit engagement with communities that, that kind of position organizations as the expert in what people need rather than the people themselves who experience those problems on a daily basis. So it's relinquishing resource and kind of, resources and capital to those communities so they can implement the solutions that they see best fit for themselves. I've always questioned, for example, there's all of this federal relief funding coming to nonprofit organizations to do good work in the community. Why don't they just give that money directly to people in the community to do the work that they see most necessary? And that's an ongoing conversation, but we are moving towards that level of sovereignty that I think is going to be the best place to engage solutions, and to check some of our assumptions that we know what's best for people, or organizations know what's best for people, rather than people knowing what's best for themselves.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think that's very well put. And I think the models are changing. I hope that they're changing. And I think the research supports that, that community members in their communities, and they just have a greater stake. Someone in the community can't just buzz off and leave a project behind. They have a stake. Their family, their community is there. There's more follow through, and I think there's a lot of research to support that. So it's really great to hear that, and I look forward to more of that momentum.
Me too.
Support it. I just want to thank you so much for taking some time to speak with me today.
Well, I just also want to offer folks the opportunity to connect with us as well. We can also put them in the right direction if they're interested.
And we'll put resources, like we'll link resources as well. But if you want to name some things, that's great too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Instagram, our Instagram handle for the farm is EG Microgreens. And for the food hub, it's East Denver Food Hub. My email is roberto@eastdenverfoodhub.com. Folks can reach out to me there. And yeah, we're happy to be partners and conduits and always looking to collaborate and innovate.